It's so good to be back in worship with you all after 2 weeks away on vacation. One of the things that I did to just relax and escape this exhausting season was to read. I started with a light whodunit, a book from the Cat Who mystery series by Lillian Jackson Braun. I started with The Cat Who, 8 Danish Modern, and then after a couple more serious books, I ended with The Cat Who Turned On and Off. The author of this Cat Who mysteries does a good job of setting the scene. Unsolved murders and mysterious thefts and unusual circumstances all pile up, along with a whole host of possible suspects, and you're kept wondering to the last page, what is going on here? Well-known Christian author Philip Yancey has described the book of Job like a whodunit detective story. As the scene is set in chapters 1 and 2, we get a glimpse at the cosmic drama unfolding in heaven. But Job, the star detective, from his earthly perspective, within that story, is trying to solve the mystery of this crazy series of disasters. What's going on here? He's wondering, why me? Is God trying to tell me something? And Job, along with his wife and his friends, spend the rest of this book trying to make sense of this great suffering and loss. And we, as readers of the story, are drawn in by the mystery of how Job is going to respond. Who's going to be right? God or the Satan? In the original Hebrew of this book, whenever the word Satan is used, the definite article is always attached, the Satan. It's not so much as a name as it is a title or a position. The verb in Hebrew, to Satan, means to accuse. So the Satan is the accuser or the adversary, as the translation I read from this morning says. It's something like the role of the prosecuting attorney. The heavenly scene is like a heavenly courtroom, and the Satan is like the district attorney serving as an employee of God's government to investigate problems and place charges when things don't seem quite right. The Satan here does not appear to be the devil, and his role is quite limited. After the first 2 chapters, he's not mentioned again, and God is clearly the one in charge. As Job will declare in chapter 12, God is sovereign and he holds all things in his hands. Every living soul, yes, every breathing creature. But the whole setup for this story seems bizarre. It feels just plain wrong. I don't know about you, but makes me feel uncomfortable as I read it. Is this heavenly conversation for real? Why does God need an accuser to work on God's behalf? Why does God draw attention to Job, who is kind and good, honest, generous, and in right relationship with God? It says that twice. Only then to allow Job and his family to be targeted. Why? It's especially shocking when the adversary says to God in that courtroom scene of chapter 2, "You incited me against Job to ruin him without any reason." Wow, that description of God just does not jive with the picture we have of God in any other book of the Bible. So, what is going on here? How are we to understand it? One of the things that helps me make sense of this is the issue of genre, the kind of literature that this book is. Most biblical scholars do not regard the story of Job as a historical account in which the author is somehow granted a vision of actual heavenly events. Rather, we're to read this story more like a parable, a story that allows the questions of undeserved suffering and pain to be explored. Uz is not an actual place that can be found documented in other historical literature or maps. Uz may be more like the land of Oz, a place where Dorothy and Toto open up the imaginative space for us to think about what it means to have a heart or a brain or courage. The story of Job in the land of Uz opens up the imaginative space for us to think about what it means to have faith and to have integrity in faith. This is a story of a crisis of faith. Job has his faith in God tested by a series of disasters that befall him, and after the second scene in heaven, by a terrible illness that strikes him, painful sores from head to toe. And as uncomfortable as these opening scenes make us feel, they open up the space for us to think about why bad things happen to good people. Because as we listen in on God's perception of Job, we have no doubts. God leaves no doubt that God is pleased with Job. God calls him honest and of absolute integrity. Even as Job goes on to try to figure out why these disasters happened, and as his friends make accusations against Job that maybe he did something wrong, that there's something amiss in his relationship with God, that we know what God really thinks can be reassuring for us. That it was nothing that happened to Job was a result of his failure. Nothing that happened, none of his suffering is a result of sin. Over the years, I've heard many people express doubt in the face of terrible events in their lives. Am I being punished for something I did or didn't do? Is God angry with me? Is God out to get me for some reason? Many are wondering that in these days, as the pandemic surges, as locust plagues descend in parts of Africa and Asia, as storms and floods and earthquakes and uprisings rage, as people starve. Is God punishing the world? Or maybe, as Greg shared last week, the question that Aubrey asked him, is this the end of the world? Is God or some evil power deliberately bringing disasters upon us? We all know that poor choices can indeed bring unpleasant consequences. But this story of Job confirms that life can be difficult even when your heart is right with God. You can have the strongest faith and the greatest love for God and still face painful losses and difficult challenges. The story of Job debunks that theology of retribution that says when those who behave according to God's ways can expect only rewards and blessings, and those who behave badly will be ruined. This story also debunks that prosperity gospel that promises wealth if you're faithful and sees poverty as a result of the sinfulness of the poor. God doesn't operate on a tit-for-tat basis. That's not how God works. That's not God's heart. By overhearing this conversation in heaven written by this author, in fact, we know that what happens is not simply a test of Job's faith. It's ultimately not actually a test of Job. It's a test of God. The book is less about Job than it is about God. Listen again to the Satan's accusation. He says, does Job revere God for nothing? Or as Eugene Peterson puts it in The Message, so do you think Job does all of that out of the sheer goodness of his heart? Why, no one ever had it so good. You pamper him like a pet. Make sure nothing bad ever happens to him or his family or his possessions. The adversary is accusing God of buying Job's love and loyalty. He suggests that Job is only devoted to God because God has protected him and blessed him. The adversary cynically implies that humans are incapable of loving God just for who God is, but only for what they can get out of God and what they can get out of the relationship with God. No wonder God must address the question of whether we are created freely and truly to love, and whether God is worthy of worship for more than what God can provide. What do you think? Is it possible for you to love God simply for who God is? God has a lot at stake on Job's response. God is trusting Job to prove the Satan wrong. And over the next few weeks, we will take a closer look at Job's responses, at how he wrestles with his grief and tries to understand his suffering. And we'll find out what happens to his faith in God through that process. The good news is that God doesn't leave humanity to wrestle alone or to carry the weight of proving God to be good all by ourselves. We have been given a defense attorney and a true friend. God entered into the world, into the human struggle himself, to walk alongside us and answer the challenge on our behalf. God sent his son, Jesus, to experience the worst that the world can do: lies and false accusations, the betrayal of family and friends, hunger, pain, undeserved suffering. Jesus even experienced that very human sense of abandonment by God, crying out on the cross as he died, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet through it all, Jesus was faithful. His love for God and his love for all people did not waver, nor did he abandon his purpose of ensuring that every person can love God and love others genuinely, unconditionally, freely, selflessly, with the help of the Holy Spirit. It may be that God has a lot at stake in our response, or perhaps our family and friends and neighbors have a lot of stake in our response as we wrestle with the whodunit questions to the tragedies and disasters of this day, as we look to place blame or to make sense of it. It's a mystery. How is your story going to turn out? How will you respond? Will you love God only for what God has given you? Or will you love God for who God is? May the Lord give us the strength that we need each day. And I'm going to invite Chuck as we prepare to take communion.